You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96, and we just heard the completed the Jazz Zone with T.N. Providence, and joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne, who is he holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, and he has written so many books I can't even keep up. Has your latest book dropped?
Yeah, you can find it now. And of course, there's a book signing in Washington, D.C. on June 3rd at 6 p.m. in the Adams Morgan neighborhood. The advertisement should be up soon on the website of WPFW-FM in Washington. It's a benefit for them. And then in New York City on June 19th, Juneteenth, in Brooklyn at Sister's Place. You ought to be able to put that in the search engine and find it.
Let me have one question before we get into it. Are any of those speeches, are they going to be on Zoom so people around the country and around the world can see and hear them?
I'm not sure, but if there is a manifested demand, it will be.
Okay. All right.
It has to be a demand.
Understand. So that's up to that's up to us to create the demand. You're right.
Exactly.
I have I guess the first question we wanted to talk about is I was watching the news. The United States, the news people in America are saying that it is only an accusation that Russia has anything to do with the attack on the Kremlin. First of all, could you talk about, what exactly took place and what took place and why would I guess the U.S. is trying to deny it, of course.
What took place is that a few days ago at 2:30 a.m. in the morning, 2:30 a.m. in the morning, Moscow time, there was a drone attack on the Kremlin, which is the seat of power in Russia, in Moscow. President Putin has an apartment there. He was not present at the time of the drone attack. It's quite serious. It would imagine, if you will, a drone attack on the White House or a drone attack on Mr. Trudeau's headquarters in Ottawa, for example. The Ukrainians denied it, but of course they would. The United States, a la their explanation in quotation marks about the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, which they said was done by Moscow, even though it would be the equivalent of Moscow putting a gun at its temple and pulling the trigger. Likewise, there's no rational explanation for Moscow to attack itself, unless you suggest that the leaders are somehow suicidal. This comes in the prelude to the holiest day on the Russian calendar, which is May 9th. I believe that's Tuesday, where you have the march and celebration of the victory over fascism in 1945. Of course, that would be also an opportunity for the Ukrainians, or those who advise the Ukrainians, and yes, I'm speaking of Washington, to launch a similar attack. But it's difficult to really discuss the danger and the peril of attacking a nuclear power at the seat of its power. Speaking of the Kremlin, we all recall what happened on September 11, 2001, when Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon were attacked. The United States was so bold and audacious as to wage war on Iraq, even though it had nothing to do with that attack. So it's incumbent upon us to compel the hotheads in Washington to cool it. They're walking on a red line. They're skating on thin ice. And what's at play is a clear danger to international peace and security.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. We're on the line with Dr. Gerald Horne and Melinda Francis. You have a question, any questions for Dr. Horne?
Yes. Do we want to jump into Russia and Cuba?
Well, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, recently visited Havana as part of a tour that also took him to Brazil and to Venezuela. His trip to Havana could not have come at a more opportune moment because the blockade is really suffocating the socialist island to the point where May 1st, May Day, which is usually the occasion for massive manifestations of worker power and marches, that did not take place, not least because of the energy crisis in Havana. And our understanding is that Mr. Lavrov, on behalf of the Russian Federation, has begun to stuff the pipeline with material aid and support to socialist Cuba, which hopefully will be manifesting within weeks, if not sooner. And once again, this comes at an opportune moment. And I'm hoping that President Xi Jinping of China, who, as you know, is under enormous pressure from US imperialism, will seek the opportunity to turn the tables on Washington by making his own trip to Havana and pledging aid to Cuba. Let us hope that this message reaches Beijing.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Now, you are recommending that people, read the current edition of Foreign Affairs. First of all, Foreign Affairs, who is the audience of Foreign Affairs? Foreign Affairs is very expensive, but you can't get it online. And, why should we try to read this current edition? And you're talking about this. There's an article called Order of Oppression, Africa's Quest for a New International System. I believe you're talking, that's a major article you want people to look at, right?
Well, no, actually, it's really the first few articles because first of all, Foreign Affairs is a journal published on the posh Upper East Side of Manhattan. It's an elite publication. It's where the U.S. ruling class, particularly the neocons and neoliberals, congregate. And as of now, there is a split in the U.S. ruling class between the neocons and the neoliberals on the one side and the Trumpistas on the other. The Trumpistas want to cut a deal with Russia so they can focus like a laser beam on China. The neocons and the neoliberals want to go after Russia and China. To the estimation of some, that makes the latter, that is to say the neocons and neoliberals, more dangerous than the Trumpistas, because the Trumpistas only want to fight one war. The neocons and neoliberals want to fight two wars. And I recommend this issue because as Foreign Affairs is an organ of the neocons and neoliberals, you can tell that they're feeling the heat because of the fact that this escapade in Ukraine has not brought Russia to its knees. And that has not happened, not least because the so-called global South has not signed on. And so the first few articles are basically productions by, I think it's fair to say, representatives of the so-called global South from Brazil, for example, India, and South Africa, and all of whom represent the leading line in Brasilia, in New Delhi, and in Pretoria. And so they rake U.S. foreign policy over the coals. And that's the reason why I suggested, I should say, that these articles be read. Of course, I'm not suggesting that you buy it. Go to a bookstore and thumb through it. Try to find a bootleg copy online. Go to a library, because you rarely see that publication admit or allow any critique whatsoever of U.S. foreign policy, despite all of the debacles and fiascos of Afghanistan, Iraq. They rarely admit error. I mean, it's like papal infallibility. And so the fact that they allow these writers from Brazil, South Africa, and India to critique U.S. foreign policy, I think it represents the fact that the neocons and neoliberals in Washington are feeling the heat, that they had to allow this critique to take place. And hopefully it's a sign of further upheaval in the U.S. ruling elite.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Do you think that a grandma is, I think, is a Cuban publication? What would you say that is there anything? What would you suggest that people read inside the United States in terms of The Final Call, The Burning Spear? Or what are some of the publications you would suggest? Your writings, of course, but what are some of the suggestions that you would have for people to read about, to keep up on foreign affairs?
Well, the New York Times and Washington Post, basically. I mean, that's where you get the elite point of view. And if you're intelligent and have a framework through which you can digest and analyze news, you can get a lot from the New York Times and Washington Post. Now, if you don't have a framework, you might just be swept along with their propaganda. I also read the Financial Times of London because it represents a sort of North Atlantic point of view. It oftentimes represents a European Union point of view, despite Brexit, despite Britain exiting the European Union, because, of course, the Financial Times opposed Brexit. So, I mean, there are all sorts of art. Foreign Policy is another publication, and it's the U.S. elite publication. One of the weaknesses of the U.S. left, and I would say, and in particular the Black community, come on, I've been railing about this for so many years, it's ridiculous. They act like the world is the United States. They rarely look beyond the shores. As a matter of fact, it's this left-wing news service, which I will not mention its name, which is pro-U.S. intervention in Ukraine. And so I can't get out of my mind that it made a critique of people like myself who are trying to look at the larger consequences and ramifications of Ukraine by seeing it as stage one of a two-stage attack on Russia first, then China, stage two. And this news service, whose name I will not deign to mention, said that we were cosplaying Henry Kissinger, that you're not allowed to look beyond the tunnel vision of Ukraine. You can't look at ramifications towards China, which was obviously ludicrous. But that's the depths to which I'm afraid to say some in the U.S. left have sunk.
Well, I'll give you an example. I remember I was living in Detroit, and I was sitting down reading the Detroit News or the Detroit Free Press, and James Foreman, the great international figure who was largely responsible for SNCC's whole international outlook, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. So he busted me reading it was either the Free Press or the New York or the Detroit Times, and he looked at me and he basically says, "Little brother," he said the same thing you just said. He said, "If you're going to find out anything about what's happening in the world, you have to read the New York Times. Try to read the New York Times as often as you can. Go to the library, or at that time in the 70s, you had a lot of newsstands, so you You might, and it wasn't really that expensive at that particular time either. He definitely said the same thing you told me. You must read.
Well,
New York
also,
Times.
if you have a public library card, you can read for free just about anything in the world. I mean, I hope people realize that.
True. Yep.
There are
the only
fewer excuses for ignorance
We
in
also
the
have
developed capitalist countries. Sorry?
We also have like a lot of access to information that we didn't have before, like at our
That's for sure.
fingertips.
Yeah, I mean,
you can even get it online now. Like your library card is online now in Toronto. You don't even have to go to the library anymore. Anyway, that's an aside.
You have another question, Melinda?
Yeah. Do we want to go into the visit by Ferdinand Marcos Jr. in the U.S.?
Yeah, he was in Washington. It's very frightening because Philippines is becoming a spearhead against the People's Republic of China. There were military maneuvers with the Philippines military and the U.S. military just days ago. The United States has resuscitated bases in the Philippines that stretch back to the U.S. takeover of the archipelago at the end of the 19th century. Recall as well that Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is the son of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. And there hangs a tale because Sr. was accused after he was driven out of office 30 odd years ago of escaping with billions of dollars. There are lawsuits in the United States to recover that money. I'm sure Jr. does not want to turn that money over to these claimants. And so that gives the United States leverage over him, not to mention the fact that there are territorial disputes with regard to the South China Sea between the Philippines and China. But it's very dangerous, not only militarily, but also one of the things that people need to understand about the world, particularly that part of the world, is that in Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand to the Philippines, including Indonesia, those of Chinese ancestry are usually at the top of the socioeconomic pyramid. In fact, you cannot begin to understand China's development in the last few decades without understanding investment from the Chinese diaspora, particularly in Southeast Asia, particularly places like the Philippines. Likewise, when you had this conflict between Vietnam and China, right after the United States was ousted from Vietnam in the mid-1970s, you recall that China waged war on Vietnam. Part of it had to do with the fact that Vietnam was moving against the elite in Vietnam. China interpreted that as moving against the Chinese in Vietnam, who happened to be the elite. That was one of the many reasons for that conflict. Of course, the other reason was China paying off its debt to U.S. imperialism for all that massive direct foreign investment. So going forward, what's going to happen, I'm afraid, is that as China becomes more powerful, the Chinese diaspora is going to come under more pressure. You see that in the United States. You see all the hate crimes against the Chinese diaspora in this country. I would imagine something similar is taking place in Vancouver, British Columbia, which has a very influential Chinese diaspora there. So it's a very sensitive question that we're all going to have to pay attention to, because it runs the risk of whipping up not only hysteria against the Chinese diaspora, but hysteria against any who have not been inducted into the hallowed halls of whiteness.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Now, we wanted to talk about another lynching of a black man in New York City, and was Richard Wright? What was the name of Richard Wright's book? Was it 100 Years of Lynching? The book he wrote about lynching.
I don't recall.
Well, I'll Google it while we're talking. What is the young man that was killed was I guess a Michael Jackson impersonator, and I know it's worldwide news. It's how are people responding to it?
It's certainly worldwide news. As a matter of fact, if you go to the Activist News Network, you'll find a segment I did the other day on Press TV out of Iran, where I recommended that this case be brought before the Human Rights Council of the United Nations and before the United Nations General Assembly as part and parcel of a general indictment of U.S. imperialism and their treatment of people of African descent. Now, Jordan Neely at a subway stop, the F train stop, Broadway Lafayette, was put in a stranglehold by a ex-Marine, Euro-American, who had 2 overseas deployments. I speculated on Press TV that he may have learned how to kill while in the Marines, perhaps serving in Afghanistan or Iraq. Others held down Mr. Neely as he was killed. Apparently, an official authority has suggested or has argued that this was murder. The young man who killed Mr. Neely has not been arrested. And in fact, once again, you see this charade in the United States. Speaking of the New York Times, their front page article the day after, this happened a few days ago, suggested that there was a split opinion in New York City about this incident. I guess some people are suggesting that maybe he should have been killed. That's what I assume a split opinion means. And I think it illustrates something that we're all too familiar with. That is to say, on the level of generalization, most folk, including many Euro-Americans, would say that they're against vigilante action and lynching. But if you get down to a concrete case, like Jordan Neely being strangled and killed on camera, there's a split opinion. They're not so sure if anybody should be held to account. This is why we need international intervention. And it also connects to my previous point, where I was suggesting that the major weakness of the Black liberation movement in this country, by and large, with a few notable exceptions, is that they have little conception of the idea of using global leverage to improve our position. So on the one hand, they're always complaining about white supremacy, but the remedy that we've used historically to beat back white supremacy, it rarely dawns on them. Assuming that humanity survives, historians of the future will be scratching their heads about that conundrum.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96, and the book I was talking about was 100 Years of Lynching by Richard Wright. I guess people can, whatever, however they want to get it. There's libraries, and now they can do a Google search. You might be able to even get the whole book right now because it might be public domain. You had another question, Melinda?
Do we want to talk about the collapsing U.S. banks?
It's very serious. The financial system in this country is on the ropes. Just the other day, First Republic had one of the most sizable bank collapses in the history of the United States. This follows in the wake of the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, very important to the fortunes of the high-tech industry. It does not look good right now. And when it does not look good financially, like a seesaw, that raises the possibility for war, because the United States is like the neighborhood bully. If it suffers financial reverses, it chooses to hit other people in the head and take their stuff. And that's one of the reasons why you see the ratcheting up of tensions with China, the ratcheting up of tensions with Russia. But I think that U.S. imperialism and focusing on those two giants may be biting off more than it can chew.
Yes, sir. I guess we have about 9 minutes left. I wanted to. Can we talk about the NBA? The playoffs won, and what is your assessment of Joel Embiid the Cameroonian young man becoming the MVP of the whole basketball situation?
Well, Mr. Embiid only started playing basketball about 10 years ago. He, of course, wound up attending University of Kansas. He plays for the Philadelphia 76ers. He's 7 foot tall and 280 pounds. Very agile, although even though I picked his team, Philadelphia, to win it all, it doesn't look good right now. And there's another note as well. That is to say, the Los Angeles Lakers are playing the Golden State Warriors. There's a new biography out of LeBron James of the LA Lakers. By the way, his son has just agreed to matriculate at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. But the new biography by Jeff Benedict, there's an article in the New York Times this morning where he says that even though he did enormous research for this book, he steered clear of the subject of trying to find out who LeBron James' father is, which is something of a mystery. I speculate, and I'm only speculating since I don't know who his father was either, that since LeBron is almost 6 feet 9 inches tall and about 250 pounds, I suspect that his father might be of a similar stature, but obviously genes have a strange and funny way of manifesting. But it is something of a mystery. And it also may explain why LeBron James has spent so much time with his own children, because he grew up without a father.
Well, don't you think that LeBron James, he gets a bad rap from believe it or not, some people, I've heard people criticizing LeBron James because he's not a real brother because he doesn't have a criminal record. I mean, he's I guess almost squeaky clean, wouldn't you say?
Who is it that says you have to have a criminal record to be a real brother? I don't understand that concept.
Oh, you got the whole get rich or die trying, the whole 50 Cent phenomenon, and that's a lot of people in hip hop, take that position. You have to be a brother off the street, a real brother. You have to have served some time. I've heard people criticize Farrakhan because I don't think he's ever had a traffic ticket.
Well, what this reminds me of, it's an infamous case in Baltimore where you have this black male prisoner. He's running drugs out of the prison. He's in prison. He's flipped some of the prison guards to basically serve his interests, shall we say. Mm-hmm. And at one point, he's quoted as saying, "This is my prison." Well, okay, it's your prison. You're locked up. I guess you feel that you're accomplishing something despite the fact you're behind bars. But I think that what that ties into is something we talked about before, the sort of valorizing of the lumpen. You see this in the wake of the Hulu series on Tupac Shakur and Afeni Shakur, because the Black Panther Party, as we've talked about before, infamously, they put forward the idea of the lumpen. I don't think they really understood that concept. As I said, my forthcoming reader will have an excavation of that concept. I don't think they ever looked historically at the lumpen. That is to say, they basically conflated the lumpen with the reserve army of labor. That is to say, if you're unemployed, that means you're the lumpen. No. That is not scientifically precise nor accurate. It's part of the tomfoolery that led to the virtual liquidation of the Black Panther Party. And that's similar tomfoolery that suggests that to be a real brother, you have to have a criminal record. I mean, we have to understand the roots of that tomfoolery, but call it what it is. It's nonsense.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. And how do you see the whole question of the baseball season unfolding?
Well, the Yankees are lagging. The Tampa Rays are surging. Oakland is on the verge of moving to Las Vegas. I expect the New York Mets to do well. What about your Toronto Blue Jays?
They're doing fairly well. You know, Vladimir Guerrero is doing wonders. You know, working out as a great first baseman. And Vladdy and his father, they got a fast food commercial. You know, it's kind of funny to see it. You know, so Vlad is really being he has been embraced by a part of the corporate people. I guess they recognize the fact that Vlad is he's the man when it comes. One of the people when it comes to baseball, and the future is tied to him in this particular city.
Has he been to prison?
As far as I know, not at all.
Well, I guess that means he's not a real black man.
If you listen to 50 Cent and those type of people, yes.
Yeah, and
by the way, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, check out the series on Hulu if you can, or find a bootleg copy off the record of Dear Mama. It's the documentary
on Tupac
about Tupac Shakur and his mother, Afeni, who was part of the Panther 21. It's sort of a sad and tragic tale because we all know that Tupac is killed in Las Vegas at the age of 27, shot in the streets. The crime has yet to be, quote, solved, unquote. But part of the tragedy is that Tupac, who is a very sensitive poet and actor, gets caught up in that whole gangster life. And really, he begins to insult people like he's this gangster as opposed to a young man that's 5'11" tall and 155 pounds. And so he winds up in a grave. And so it's that sort of mentality that leads to his unfortunate demise. So excuse me for going on this point, but after just seeing the fourth part of this 5-part series, the fifth part will, of course, detail his death. It just seems like such a waste that this actor who was in Poetic Justice, if I'm not mistaken, was in Juice, was trained at the High School of Performing Arts in Baltimore, trained in Marin City, California in drama, very productive rapper, gets caught up in this whole gangster thing. Or as the tattoo on his torso read,
Thug life.
Thug life. Thug life. It's part of the valorizing. And once again, I've argued, and pick up the Gerald Horne Reader when it's out in a few months, that this whole valorizing of the lumpen and thugs and gangsters, it's a direct outgrowth on the fact that in the preceding epoch, our community had developed giants of the working class, like Ferdinand Smith of Jamaica, who helped to found the National Maritime Union in the United States, one of the most powerful unions in the United States. Then, of course, was deported, which was part of the attack on the Red Scare on the Black working class, on Black proletarian leaders. And as Black proletarian leaders began to decline, filling the vacuum was this thuggery and gangsterism. Just as abroad, when you had the attack on the left, when you saw the killing of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, arising in the fill the vacuum, were religious zealots. And so the sooner we absorb these basic fundamental lessons, the better off we all will be.
I think that's it, my friend. Thank you. We will definitely check back with you next week. And I would like to thank Melinda Francis, Elisa Watson for her technical brilliance. And